I've got to just say, in contrast to Laura's slides, mine are basically completely the opposite. There are no illustrations. This is pure and utter code porn. But no one's going to feel demeaned at the end of it, hopefully. I've got to make a small apology as well. You might have seen the title of my talk and the introduction to my talk, and I've made a couple of changes, which is the title and the introduction. The subject are no longer the same. Only small changes, but I was going to write kind of a very prosaic thing about getting hands-on and doing nuts and bolts stuff, but then as I was reading through the specs, I just kept finding loads of really, really cool new stuff that's coming soon. So I'm going to change emphasis slightly and talk about the really cool new stuff, but in the boring aspects that I was going to talk about before. So the title of this talk is changing ever so slightly. It's now just CSS, the boring bits, because I am going to be talking about some CSS3 in this as well. When I was preparing this talk, I started thinking about, boring things that people like, really boring things, and I came up with a little list of like incredibly boring things. The Matrix Revolutions is one of the most boring films I've ever seen in my life. Not widespread support for that one, no. Basically, as far as I can remember, it's 45 minutes of a guy shooting a gun and 45 minutes of two guys punching each other in the rain. And I still don't know what happened, what the film was about. But I'm never going to find out, because that would mean going back to watch the film, and that's not going to happen. Lord of the Rings. Take out all the very long walking bits and the 15 different endings. You've got like a 90-minute film, which would have been quite exciting. It just never ended though, did it? It just kept ending, and every time you thought it was ending, there would another ending would come along. The third film was just endings. Coldplay.
I'm a phone.
We've got the one Coldplay fan in here who's a bit insulted by that. No, Coldplay, I appreciate what they do. They're craftsmen and stuff, and they've got certain skills in songwriting, but with the best will in the world, they are fucking boring. Apple versus Android. If I have to read another word about this year, I'm going to go crazy. It's so boring. Who cares? Get over it. Thank you. So I'm going to talk about some of the really boring stuff. I'll get to that in a minute. But people tend to get more excited about the really flashy stuff in CSS3. Transitions and animations and all that kind of things. And there is some exciting stuff coming up in CSS like that. You've got things like you'll be able to do native filters in CSS, which means you'll be able to just do just add grayscale, take your images and change them to grayscale or do whatever on the fly, add sepia coloring, there's all kind of things, blur, and just live graphical stuff, and that's pretty exciting, but it doesn't really interest me very much. Crossfading, CSS crossfading, you can actually put in two images and set the distance between them and kind of set a crossfade, so you can fade one thing into another, and very cool that you can do that in CSS now, but I can't really think of any use case for it apart from, fading two images into each other, and that just doesn't happen very often. What I'm really interested in is the boring stuff, the really kind of nuts and bolts things that you will never ever see in probably things like Smashing Magazine. They will never write, 50 amazing techniques to, use selectors or that kind of thing. And that's where I get really, really interested in, finding these little nuts and bolts things and unique and new ways to use them. So I'm going to talk you through some of the stuff that's coming up, hopefully in the next year or so. Some of it you can use right now. It's not all massively practical, but some of it you can use right now. Some of it you'll probably be using within, a year to 18 months. And some of it is just proposals and may end up getting scrapped. But it's all interesting to look at the way that the language of CSS is evolving through the boring parts. So first of all, I'm going to talk a little bit about backgrounds and borders. You're all aware of what they are, right? Has anyone here seen the 4-value background position yet? This has just landed in Firefox. I think it's going to be in Firefox 12, 11 or 12. And I think it's also in WebKit. Basically, at the moment, background position is 2 values, right? It's across and down, basically. With this, you can now use 4 values. So you can do the horizontal value and a number, and the vertical value and a number, like this. So right 20 pixels, bottom 10%. You can now, there's going to give you just a whole lot more control over the way you position your background images. And you know, most people aren't interested in that. I think that's amazing. I think that's so cool. It's really hard at the moment to do something that's kind of always 10 pixels away from the right-hand side, for example. Border corner shape as well. So at the moment, you can have your square borders or your rounded borders. Border corner shape is going to let you do things like beveled corners, which will just kind of angle that off. Using all the same syntax we've got now, just this new property. Again, this is going to be implemented quite soon. And border clip, which takes these two values, x and y, and you can repeat them as many times as you like. Now, what does this mean? Well, the x and the y, it's kind of, they repeat visible and invisible. Okay, what does that mean? Okay, so you can do things like this. You can say border clip, 10 pixels, 1 fraction, 10 pixels. That means only show the first 10 pixels, then hide the next fraction, the rest of it, and then show the next 10 pixels. Just with a combination of all these values, you're going to be able to make completely custom borders for all your stuff. None of you look that impressed. I think that's really exciting. But that's probably still a little bit too close to kind of being exciting CSS for me. I want to go a little bit kind of more boring still. And what could be more boring than namespaces? Anybody here use XML to a great degree? You will soon. It's the future of the web. So in XML, you can define namespaces for all the different whatever. But the one way you will be using XML a lot, and you definitely will in the next few years, is with SVG, right? So SVG images are going to get a lot more important to use as we move into this era of super high definition screens. You know, bitmaps are just going to lose resolution, or you've got to use massive images and scale them down. So I think we'll be using SVG quite a lot more. With namespaces, you can. So that's how you declare a namespace in CSS. So just like the way you do it in HTML, you say that I'm going to use XHTML and I'm going to use SVG. And then you can style things. So this is a standard link that will affect every link on the page, but you can also say, you can namespace your CSS as well. So this will only affect things that are in the SVG namespace. So you can apply styles just to the SVG without worrying about the rest of the page. Boring and exciting. Unicode range, this is for web fonts. Again, you can use this right now in everything except Firefox, I think. What does this do? Well, you can declare, when you declare your font face, you can say only the range of characters that you want to use, like that. So you can say, this is the font I'm going to use, but only use these 2 or 3 characters that I've got here. Don't load the rest of the font, just these. Why is that important? Well, here's an example of a font which is kind of almost a 300K download, and that's just for a single bold serif. And that's quite common, I guess. But it's like 300K download, and it takes 1.5 seconds to load. And if I declare, this is an extreme example, but in the next example, I'm going to be loading just 1 character. You can see it's just downloaded 108 bits out of that file, and the loading time is much faster. It's less than half a second. So being able to pick and choose characters out of the font you want to load in, boring and exciting. Device adaptation. Now this is a big thing for the mobile web. Device adaptation at the moment, when we want to use mobile, when we want to tell the browser that this should be a mobile site, we just use the meta tag, right? And it's a very blunt instrument because that applies to then every browser that visits that page. And things like tablets have to kind of basically work around it or ignore it or whatever they do to not just show the mobile page. And it just seems like a weird way to implement it. So why not do it in CSS? So in CSS you can declare a viewport and you can do all these things. And the reason that's exciting is because you can then combine them with media queries and have a different viewport value for each breakpoint or whatever that you end up using. So you can set all these different values on a per device basis. It doesn't get more boring than values, right? Who cares about values? Who cares about colors and width and that kind of stuff? I do. That's my only visual joke, so I'm glad you guys laughed at that one. The Rem unit, what's that? It's the root M. Okay, so you must know in CSS you can use M, which is a relative font size. But it's relative. It's also relative. It kind of inherits that relativity. Is that right? Whatever, you understand what I mean. So kind of, if we set the body up to have 10 pixel font size, and then we set the header 1 to be 24, or 2.4 EM, which would be 24 pixels, and then say we want a span inside that to be 22 pixels, we want it to be slightly smaller, we end up having to use calculations like that, because it's relative to the parent, and that's quite a simple example as well, because it's relative to, it's inherited that kind of, the font size from the parent. So with the root EM, we, instead of using the EM value, we use root EM, and it only ever is taken from the 10 pixels, which is applied to the document root. So the same value would be 2.2 REM. You don't have to worry about it inheriting values from parents and all that kind of stuff. So when you're using relative font values, this is really, really useful. And you can use this more or less right now in everything apart from Internet Explorer 9 and below. We should have a different word for Internet Explorer 9 and below, because there's, I don't, like shit Internet Explorer or something. There's good Internet Explorer and there's shit Internet Explorer, and everyone will know which one you mean when you talk about them. As a quick side note, I'm very, very excited about Internet Explorer 10. I genuinely think it looks like a proper world-class browser, and I hope people get to use it as much as they can. No joking there, it's heartfelt emotion. You can do, so relative sizes also not just apply to fonts and things like that, but they also apply to the document itself, the viewport. If you're doing a percentage width, you say you have something which is 50%, and then any element inside that is done as a percentage width of its parent again. So say you want to do then a third, it's, you know, it gets complicated, it gets difficult. So why not have a unit like REM that works for sizes, that works for the whole viewport. And that's where we have this, VH, VW, VMin. VH means viewport height, VW means viewport width, and VMin means either one of the two, whichever one is smaller. I don't know why there's not a Vmax either, except that it sounds kind of like an energy drink. But yeah, for whatever reason there isn't one. So how does this work? The width of the viewport is always 100 VW. So every width you can specify after that can just be in VWs, and it will always be relative to that width of the viewport. You don't have to worry about the size of the parent element or anything like that. It's always relevant to the viewport. You can do things like that. 25 VW will always be exactly the same width. So it's relative, but it's not kind of, it's not inherited. So it's better than using pixel values, and it's better than using percentage values if you're doing layout. Sorry?
What's that supposed to do? Does that work anywhere?
It does work in some places now, but I can't remember off the top of my head. But there are a few places, there are a few browsers that support it. I can find out for you. Not right now, but I can find out for you. So there's 100 VW again. There it is again. How many of you have seen this value, the attribute? One or two, okay. So you can use this, again, it's fairly well supported in some places. Basically, the value you put inside there will be an attribute value. Say you have an href, an anchor element with an href on it. If you put href inside that, that will mean the value, which is the value of the attribute. I should have done an example for this one. Oh, I did. So if I use that, I could use attribute titles. That would be whatever the title attribute is, would be available to you in CSS, and you could use it. But you can only use it in a very specific way, which I'll show you in a second. But it always returns a string, which is not always that useful. It makes it quite inflexible. So in the latest versions of CSS, you'll be able to return that as different types. So you'll be able to say, get the attribute data color, and use it as a color value. So for example, if you have the data color attribute on an element, you'll be able to extract that and use it as a value for all of the children inside it, and so on. Now the attribute value at the moment you can only use on generated content, so that's like before and after if you've used those. So you have before and you, oops, sorry, a bit closer to the mic. So you have before and after, and you can use this attribute value on these. But the only way you can use generated content at the moment is on these two, before or after. But again, suggested in CSS3, you'll be able to replace the content of the element that you want to apply it to. So you use this replace keyword, and that will actually replace everything that's inside that element. So if you have an H1, you can update the value dynamically depending on the attributes it uses and stuff. You know, it is cool. It's very, very cool to me. Calc. Anyone use that? Yeah, a few people against. This is fairly well supported at the moment. So you can do calculations as a value. Instead of having a value of 100 pixels, you can have a value, for example, 75% minus 20 pixels. Which means you don't have to worry about these calculations of margin and padding and all this stuff. You can just calculate everything. It will all be done dynamically. It's going to make layouts a lot easier. And the cycle value as well. This will, if you put a comma-separated list of values inside here, it will cycle through those. So in this example here, for example, we have font style, cycle, italic, and normal. So if you use that EM somewhere, the first time it's encountered, it will become italic. But if that EM is used inside an element which is already italic, it will cycle back to normal. So you can put as many values in there as you like. The use cases, I can only think of a few use cases, but it's kind of exciting that you can do this stuff. You don't have to do loads and loads of nested selectors to take care of all these, all the possibilities. Most boring of all and closest to my heart, selectors. I get very excited about selectors. Sorry, I'm tearing up. Selectors, how many of you have used the target selector? This is like the new hotness right now. The target selector basically says, if you link to an element inside the page, that pseudo class can be used to style that element. So say you have like an anchor tag halfway down the page and you do an internal link, you can now style that differently to the rest of the page, so you can highlight the link that the person's just landed on. It makes it really clear if you're scrolling down a page, and it can just highlight the element that you've just selected. And people have realized that you can use this to do all kinds of like very cool stuff. You can build whole kind of image galleries out of CSS, no JavaScript involved whatsoever, just using this selector. It has drawbacks in the fact that it completely fucks up the back button of the browser. But that aside, if you use it carefully, it's very, very exciting. So you can do things like this element will generally have a color of red. And then if you link to it, it will change color. Or when you click the link to go to it, it will change color to be blue. If anybody uses kind of internationalized pages, anybody works on big corporate websites or big international sites, you must be familiar with kind of right to left languages, left to right languages, and up until now there's been no way to style them. But now you have this, which is the dir selector. So you can say, for example, dir RTL or LTR, and you can set styles differently to different things depending on which way the language goes, which you weren't able to do before. This one I love. The not selector. Well, at the moment, this is quite well implemented at the moment. And the company I work for, we've just built Spotify, an app for Spotify, and Spotify just uses Chromium as its browser, as its rendering engine. So we don't have to worry about any of the other browsers at all, and we can use all the cool hotness that's available in Chromium. And this one we've used so much. And the first time I used it, it was like an epiphany. It was like a road to Damascus moment. The scales fell from my eyes. And it's like, I never want to go back to not using the not selector. I might have over-exaggerated that. So what does it do? You can just put a simple selector inside it like this. So any element E, which does not have the class of foo. That seems quite simple, but it's incredibly powerful once you start using it. Because suddenly you don't need to do these rules that kind of you don't have to have the long list of selectors that exclude the class of foo, or you don't have to do the opposite thing, which is style everything and then style foo to go back to the way it was before. You can just leave them out by using this not selector. And it's, as I said, it's pretty well implemented. You can almost start using it right now. Anyone use the nth selectors? A few more people. So these are ways of iterating. You can have like nth child or nth of type, and it's for example, say you've got a long list of things. The classic example is kind of zebra striping on a table or a list or something like that. You have this long list of things, and you just want to style every other one. the only way to do it at the moment is to add a class to it, you know, programmatically add a class to it. But with the nth child, you can just say nth child odd, and it will style every odd one of that selector in a go. It's very, very cool. You can combine it with not, and this is what I actually did on this project. Honestly, I laughed so much. It was like a laugh of pure madness when I saw that you could do this. Nth child odd, not last child. Fantastic, right? Who would? Seriously, trust me, just have a go yourself. I might not be selling it to you. Have a go yourself. It is wonderful. Matches. This is a fairly new one. Used to be called any. So if any of you have used the any function, or what is it, pseudo something class, you'll know matches. And what matches does is it lets you put in a comma separated list of simple selectors inside there. I'll give you a quick example. So say you have this setup. So you have foo bar h1, foo bar h2, foo bar h3. Okay, it's a lot of repetition. With matches, you can just do this. Foo bar matches h1, h2, h3. So it just says any one, you know, take this path down to the selectors, and then when you get there, any one of these, just apply that rule. It's going to cut out so much replication that we have in our style sheets. Now these are ones that we know already, link and visited. These exist now, but again, they're not great. They're a binary state. Either something is a link or it is visited. You can't have there's nothing in between. So there's a couple of new selections on this. Hold on. Transitions. Laura didn't have those in her slides, did she? So you can say this one is any link, and that will style literally any link. It doesn't matter whether it's been visited or not, that will apply to any link that's on the page. But you can also go one further and just say local link. So only apply these styles to any link which does not link to externally from this website, which you could kind of do using the not selector. But actually you can't, because the not selector won't allow you to use a complicated, the not selector only allows you to use very simple selectors. But if you could. You can.
You could put an exclamation mark instead of a hat.
That's not equal.
Inside your square bracket.
But you're not allowed to use you can only use a simple selector inside not. So you can only use like a class selector or an element selector and not a attribute selector.
But you can get rid of the not and do square brackets, href, exclamation mark.
Why don't you come up here and do the talk then? There's actually, there was going to be another, one of my slides is missing. I was going to show on the next slide that you could do that by using the not selector, the thing that goes, I left the slide out. Column. Deceptively simple, but you can actually, if you use tables at the moment, you'll know that there's no easy way to style columns. There is a kind of the col and the col group, but they're very, very limited to what you can do with them. In CSS, we're going to be able to do style columns like this, and it's not just tables, but also anything that uses kind of a grid-based layout, like some of the new stuff that's arriving in IE10, some of the new grid layout things, and you'll be able to use this and just style columns of text in a specific way. Also, nth column and nth last column. Past, current, and future. These are amazing, right? I don't really know. I mean, they're actually not that useful on a day-to-day basis, but they just past, current, and future. You can have the future selector, the future pseudo-class. What this is useful for is when you have things that are kind of time-based. So say you're using a screen reader program that reads through the whole page. As it goes through, obviously things will be past, current, or future. So you can kind of grey out text that's already been read and highlight the one you're already on and do something different to the ones that are yet to arrive. But the past, current, and future, just the names of them is amazing. This one is slightly complicated. It took a little bit of mental kind of preparation to come up with this one. So the value in the middle, the X value here, is an attribute which so it's an attribute for the selector E, which matches the ID of the selector F. But enough about that one. No, I'll show you a practical example of that. So when you have a label and you hover it, if the for value, obviously the for value will always match the ID value of the input, so even if those two are not right next to each other on the page or whatever they are, that will always style the input related to which you've just interacted with the label for. A slightly more complicated example, data foo div. So as long as that data foo attribute has the ID of the div on the right, then anything you do to the div on the left will style that. Clear? Yeah. Okay. I think my first example was probably clearer, wasn't it? I should have left it at that one. Does anybody know what that is? Go on.
Is it the parent selector?
It's the parent selector. How long have you wanted to have a parent selector in CSS? Sorry, it's the parent selector. Right, thank you. It's all Keynote, it's very little me. So yes, you can now select the element E depending on if the element F is inside it, which is amazing. You could not do this before in CSS. So if you're thinking, oh, the string thing, that might seem, oh, but what if we start using variables or something like that? Don't worry, because variables have been taken care of as well. This is how you declare, this is the current suggestion anyway. This is how you declare a variable using this data pattern. Just like data attributes, you choose data hyphen whatever, and give it whatever name you want, and assign a value to it. You see here it's been put on the root element, but you can actually apply this to any elements. You can have scoped variables using this. For the JavaScript people among you will know what that means, but it's very cool, so you can have that, and then when you want to call them, you just do that, color data foo. So it's using an existing syntax, which is from the data attributes, and applying it to CSS, and it's got all kinds of examples, it's got all kinds of benefits to doing it that way. Scoping, not the least of them, but also, if you're into this stuff, the CSS object model makes that very, very easy to access. I hope I've shown you that boring can be exciting. I suspect a lot of what you were doing was laughing at my ridiculous enthusiasm for these tiny little Googles and stuff. But I'm really, really excited about the future of CSS. I think it's within about sort of 1.5 to 2 years when we can start really using this stuff. As I said, some of it you can use right now, but in the future when we'll be using this stuff, it's going to be so much more powerful. It's taking on kind of programmatical elements to become more like CSS or something like that. And I just think, you know, from what we know now and what we'll need to know in 2 years, they're going to be so much different, but it's very, very cool, and I can't sort of stop enthusing about it. With that, I will say this book is still available. This book is still not boring. And if you want to go out and buy a copy, my wife needs a nice new dress. And
it's available in Italian.
And it's available in Italian now for all of our Italian friends. So that's it from me, and I guess as I've rattled through it in about half an hour, we've got time for some questions if anybody wants them. By the way, I became very aware through that I kept touching my nose like that. I'm not on coke, and I haven't got a cold. It's purely a nervous tic that's developed just for tonight. So you should feel grateful you were here to witness the birth of that one. Okay, questions?
Thanks.
Hello?
Hello.
Right, the content replaced. The
Yes.
content replaced, which you mentioned with the ability to pull in the attributes. Now that
Yes.
would mean that you can essentially put content in the HTML using CSS.
Yes.
So that's styling, doing the content.
Yes. I understand. Yeah. No, there is the content behavior, and that's all supposed to be separate. I think that battle's been lost. I think that's done. When we started having animations and that kind of thing, we've already moved presentation into behavior into the presentation layer. The other thing is that may not happen. That's suggested. Someone has suggested that. If everybody comes back and says that's a terrible idea, although you can actually do it right now in Opera, but without using that replace keyword. You can just you can apply the content value to things in Opera on any element and do that right now. I don't know. Yeah, there is definitely an argument to be made saying that you shouldn't be allowed to do that. Definitely should not be allowed to happen. I completely get that. I don't have a strong opinion on that, I have to say.
And sorry for trolling you earlier.
It's all right.
What are the performance like of some of these new selectors?
The short answer is I don't know. The slightly longer answer is it's not going to matter to most people. I think I read a good thing from Paul Irish the other day when people talking about kind of using the universal selector, and they say it's much slower. And he said, well, the point he made was like, you can only worry about that stuff if you've done everything else first. If you've minified all your CSS files and you've concatenated everything so there's only one network call and there's all of that, and then when you get to that kind of 90th percentile, then there's a worry to be had in that. But for most people, it's not an issue. Thanks.
The parent selector you mentioned, is
Yes.
that proposed or is that implemented anyway?
That's not implemented anywhere. It's proposed and there is some opposition to it, as you can imagine. People... The syntax is ugly, yeah. Yeah, that's definitely, I mean, that might not be the final syntax. Again, there's been dispute about whether or not that should be the case. A lot of this stuff's still in discussion. It's not implemented anywhere. I'd love it if it was. But as you can see, it's also very, very limited. It only is literally a parent. You can't go back any further levels up. It's only the immediate parent, which alleviates, I think, some of the performance issues that people are worried about. I know browser makers are very worried that it causes a page repaint and all of that every time something changes, and it's going to slow things down, but hopefully that's not going to be an issue.
To what extent do you see the syntax of kind of SAS and less, and whether the W3C are kind of aware of that syntax and whether that would be...
SAS and less are a massive influence on this, on the rewriting of CSS3. There's a guy at Google called Tab Atkins. I'm not sure if any of you know him, but he's kind of almost single-handedly writing half of the new CSS spec. Like a lot of the CSS4 and CSS3 thing, he's writing, and he's, as much as possible, taken existing things. So he's taken like things like the not selector, obviously comes from jQuery and stuff like that. So he's looking around at all the stuff people are doing right now using other tools and trying to move that into CSS to get it as native as possible. The earlier syntax for variables was almost exactly the SAS syntax for variables. But people raised issues with it, and so they've gone for this one, which is slightly more cumbersome perhaps, but does allow you to do scoping and things like that. So it's more, in the long term, it's better, although it doesn't look quite as pretty as just using the $ or var or whatever. But yes, everything that people do and write about and use, all of this stuff, if any of you contribute to open source things, all of this stuff really, really matters and is getting listened to and is kind of having an impact on the future of CSS. One down the front. Yeah, stay away from the talent. The talent, don't touch the talent, stay away.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi, Tom. So you mentioned earlier that some of this is a CSS4.
Yes.
Timeframes, things like that.
Some timeframes and kind of calling it CSS3 or CSS4 kind of becomes irrelevant. So it's basically whenever the browser makers want to implement it, it just won't be in the CSS3 spec. But things like matches is in Firefox already. It's called Any at the moment, but it's there. And it's in, I think, WebKit, and I think they have, or they're just about to, again, it was called Any, they're about to change it to be called Matches. So even though it's in the CSS4 spec, it doesn't matter. The implementation is when browser makers put it in there. And at the end of the day, there's kind of another argument about, the W3C might say we don't want to standardize this. Basically, it doesn't matter. If the browser makers all decided to put this stuff in their browsers and they make it interoperable and it all works, they can just kind of circumlocute the W3C. So this stuff is more about just kind of, the CSS3 and CSS4 is just kind of formalizing stuff. But it doesn't mean that you won't be able to use this stuff until CSS4 is ready, because that will probably, like the final spec will probably be ready in about 8 or 9 years from now. But this stuff will all be available to use. Sorry, I went a bit Spanish then. This stuff will all be available to use before then. Not all of it. Sorry, a lot of this stuff will be available to use now or in the very near future.
I've got the mic, so. Sorry to our Spanish friends.
I wasn't mocking. I was just saying, the switch between the V and the B. It's kind of,
Okay. Good. So you mentioned past, current, present,
yes.
future.
Yes.
And you gave an example of using a screen reader and changing the colour of the text that the screen reader goes.
That was a kind of top of my head example. Right, yeah, very probably.
If you're going to use a screen reader, then there's probably a reason why you're doing that.
Yeah.
And checking. Have you got another example?
Yeah, no, I mean, this guy's already kind of shown me up. He's already proved that I know nothing about what I'm standing up and talking about. So that's two. I'm not going to bother coming back next time. Another example, I'm not sure. There's a lot of kind of timeline-based stuff happening around video and things like that. Possibly, video changing things dynamically based on the position in the video or the audio is a possible use case. I don't know, like I said, some of the stuff I can't at the moment see use cases for. Things like crossfade, people are very, very excited about it. But it's like crossfading a background image between two images. I don't get why people are so, apart from you can, I don't see why you would in most cases. But like I say, it's not up to me. I can't always come up with use cases for this stuff.
Cool. For some reason, there was one in the middle. Oh, okay. If hang on.
If they're going to be syntax changes from like ending to matches and things like that, how are you going to make sure that if you use them, it's not going to break constantly when you're writing them? Presumably there's no backwards compatibility support.
It should all be prefixed, this stuff. Like any is available, but it's moz any or WebKit any, and it will be WebKit matches and that kind of stuff. So I really don't want to get into the whole kind of is prefixing good or bad, because I've stated my opinion and everyone else is an idiot if they think I'm wrong, basically. But I think prefixing is a great way to do it. I think it's the best way to do it. But yes, all of this stuff is kind of, if you use it and you don't understand the kind of the level of implementation of it, then you've only got yourself to blame if something breaks, I think.
Will the whole, I mean, it's a selector, that's a prefix selector, will the whole line be ignored if the browser doesn't understand the prefixing?
Yes.
So that whole rule, so then you have to then write another rule for the new one.
Exactly. Yeah. Things like the not, the negation pseudo class, as it's properly called. You can use that right now. It's implemented without prefixes because it does no harm to have it in there. If it's unprefixed, then it's not going to change. It does what it does. And if you're doing any kind of only WebKit development or only, I think IE10 has it as well. So if you're doing kind of building an IE10 web app or something like that, you can use this thing right now. It's just not very safe, or not safe at all cross-browser. But I'm pretty confident that when you have this stuff and people see how cool it is, other people write polyfills and shims and that kind of stuff that allow you to use it if you want to.
Yes, so your dream comes true with the Unicode range. I was wondering, when will it be fully implemented, and will it stay in the buffer in the browser? Or
no, about the buffering, buffering I'm not sure about. I don't know. I did a very, very quick, off the top of my head, kind of very quick test, but I'm not sure about the buffering. It's almost everywhere. I think Firefox is the only major holdout. I think IE has it, and WebKit has it, and Opera has it, as far as I'm aware. So the drawback to it, obviously, is if it's not there, it will just load the whole font instead. It won't break anything. It won't stop the font from showing. It will just be onerous to the browser that doesn't support it. So I think you can use this right away. It's especially good if you're doing things like if you're using fonts as icons, which is kind of quite a hot thing at the moment. Just to download, get Wingdings and just download 4 or 5 icons, and you don't have to download the things. And it's also less important when you have things like WAF, which is already kind of cut down and only a subset of the things you want and that kind of thing. But if you're using true type fonts, it's really useful.
Yeah. Just thinking about sort of standards and us getting used to the syntax that's available.
Yes.
Is there anyone that's using or building or maintaining a mixing pack for all the processes that are based on some of these syntaxes already? So people can get used to it with Sass or Stylus, for instance.
I don't know. I think certainly there are people in the Sass community doing stuff like that. I know people like Paul Irish is very involved with Sass and Less and communicates them with them a lot. So I wouldn't be surprised if someone is, but I don't know. I don't know definitely. It's certainly a good opportunity if no one is, because it's the best way to try them out so far.